All right, so this one is special. Today's story is about a guy who spent 25 years at the same company, quarter of a century. He knew every contract, every vendor, every system. And when a new boss rolled in and tried to push him out to make room for his buddy, he didn't fight it. He just said, okay, collected a $200,000 redundancy check that nobody saw coming. And then he watched the entire department burn to the ground in 4 weeks. This man played chess while his boss was still learning checkers. Let's go. My new boss declared my role redundant to replace me with his friend. He didn't check what the payout would be. It was $200,000. Then the department collapsed. I've been debating whether to post this for a while, but honestly, I think people need to hear it, especially anyone dealing with a new boss who's trying to clean house. My name's Cole. I'm 49 now. For 25 years, I worked as the IT contracts and supplier manager for a mid-sized corporation. I won't name them, but think around 2,000 employees, multiple offices, the kind of place where nobody knows what anyone else does until something breaks. My job was basically the glue between the company and every external service provider we used. Software licenses, hardware vendors, cloud services, managed IT support, telecom contracts, security audits, all of it ran through me. I know that sounds boring. It is boring. But here's the thing about boring. When boring works, nobody notices. When boring stops, everything catches fire. I started at this company when I was 24. Entry-level procurement assistant. I wore a tie every day because I thought that's what you did in an office. I stopped wearing ties around year 3 when I realized nobody cared. Over the years, I moved up. Not fast, not dramatic, just steady. Procurement assistant to contracts, coordinator to contracts, manager to IT contracts, and supplier manager. Each title came with a little more responsibility and a little more institutional knowledge that lived nowhere except in my head. I want to explain something about this kind of work because I think most people don't understand what a contracts manager actually does. They hear contracts and think I just sign papers. No, I was the single point of failure for every external service relationship the company had. When the email server went down at 2 a.m., I was the one calling the managed services vendor's emergency line and getting an answer because the vendor's account rep had my personal cell and knew I'd helped his team hit their quota 6 years running. When we needed to renegotiate our cloud storage costs because the CFO decided we were spending too much, I was the one sitting across the table from the vendor, knowing exactly where their margin was because I'd tracked their pricing changes for 8 years. When a new department head wanted to buy some random software they saw at a conference, I was the one who checked whether we already had a license for something equivalent. And 9 times out of 10, we did. The company had over 140 active vendor contracts when I left. I could tell you the renewal date, the key contact, the negotiation history, and the gotcha clauses for every single one of them. Not from a database, from memory. I'd been managing some of these relationships longer than most employees had been at the company. By year 15, I was the only person in the company who understood the full picture of our vendor relationships. I knew which contracts auto-renewed and which ones didn't. I knew which vendors gave us preferential pricing because of relationships I'd built over a decade. I knew that our telecom contract had a clause buried on page 47 that saved us $90,000 a year if you renewed before March. And I was the only one who remembered to do it. Every year, for 10 years straight. That's $900,000 I saved the company just by checking a calendar. I also knew where the bodies were buried, so to speak. Which vendor had overcharged us in 2014 and owed us a credit. Which software license was technically expired, but the vendor hadn't noticed, and we were saving $12,000 a year by not reminding them. Is that ethical? Debatable. Did anyone above me care? Not even a little. Which security audit had flagged a vulnerability that IT still hadn't fixed 3 years later? All of it was in my head or in my personal documentation system, a series of spreadsheets, notes, and relationship maps that I'd built over 2 decades on my own laptop. My wife, Laura, used to joke that I was more married to that company than to her. She wasn't wrong, honestly. I missed anniversaries. I worked weekends. I took calls during vacations, the few we actually took. But the thing is, I believed in what I was doing. I wasn't passionate about it the way people on LinkedIn claim to be passionate about disrupting industries or whatever. I was just good at it. And being good at something for a long time creates a kind of loyalty that's hard to explain. The company wasn't exciting, but it was mine in a way. My territory, my relationships, my systems. I never expected them to throw me a parade, but I also never expected what came next. Anyway, the company went through a leadership change about 18 months ago. New CEO brought in his own people, which happens. Most of them were fine, but my new direct boss, I'll call him Drew, was not fine. Drew was maybe 35, MBA from somewhere that sounded impressive but wasn't. He had this energy like he'd read every business book published since 2020 and was itching to apply all of them simultaneously. In his first week, he scheduled alignment meetings with everyone on the team. When he met with me, he spent 40 minutes asking about my KPIs and deliverables and value proposition to the org. I told him I manage contracts and vendor relationships. He nodded and wrote something in his notebook. I have a feeling it wasn't flattering. Over the next few months, Drew started making changes. He brought in two of his friends from his previous company, one as a digital transformation specialist. Nobody could explain what that meant. And another as a strategic sourcing analyst. Both were younger than me by 15 plus years. Both made more than me. Neither could tell you the difference between a SaaS contract and a sandwich. I remember one specific meeting that crystallized everything. Drew held a department vision session, yes, that's what he called it, where he projected a slide deck with buzzwords like synergy, agile procurement, and vendor ecosystem optimization. He asked each team member to share their North Star metric. When it got to me, I said, I make sure we don't waste money on vendor contracts. He stared at me for about 4 seconds and said, can you be more specific about how that aligns with our transformation pillars? I said, I saved the company about $90,000 a year just by remembering one phone call. Is that specific enough? He moved on to the next person. After that meeting, I noticed things shifting. Drew stopped inviting me to the weekly leadership sync. He CC'd his buddies on emails that used to go only to me. He rescheduled our one-on-ones 3 times in a row, then just stopped scheduling them altogether. Little things. Death by 1,000 calendar changes. The writing was on the wall. Drew wanted his people in every seat. And my seat was the one he wanted most because it came with budget authority. Hold on, let me jump in here. This is me, not Cole. I need you to understand what's happening. Drew is a 35-year-old MBA who's been at the company for 3 months, and he's trying to push out a guy who's been there for 25 years. A guy who personally saves the company $900,000 a decade just by remembering a date. That's like firing your GPS because you bought a compass. Actually, no, that's like firing your GPS because your buddy says he's pretty good with directions. Drew, my guy, you are in danger and you don't even know it yet. Captain Corner Office is about to learn a very expensive lesson. Here's how it played out, step by step. I'm going into detail because I think people need to recognize these patterns when they see them. It could save your career, or at least your severance. Drew started giving me less work. He'd reassign contracts to his buddies. He told me to focus on wrapping up current projects and avoid taking on new ones. Classic squeeze-out move. If you've ever been managed out of a role, you know the playbook. They don't fire you. They make your job disappear around you until you quit. But I didn't quit. I've been doing this too long to fall for that. I've seen 3 rounds of layoffs, 2 mergers, and a CEO who got walked out by security for expense report fraud. I know how corporate politics works. The person who quits gets nothing. The person who gets pushed gets a package. And the person who gets pushed while holding all the institutional knowledge, that person gets whatever they want. So I waited. I kept doing my job. I kept managing contracts, saving money, maintaining relationships. But I also started doing something smarter. I started documenting everything. Every email where Drew redirected work away from me. Every meeting I was excluded from. Every contract that his unqualified friends fumbled. I kept a folder, physical and digital, with dates, names, and specifics. Not because I was planning a lawsuit, not yet, but because I've learned that in corporate environments, the person with the receipts wins. I also started quietly looking for a new job. Updated my resume for the first time in 15 years, which was its own adventure. I sat at my kitchen table on a Saturday trying to figure out how to describe what I do and ended up staring at a blank document for 45 minutes. Turns out, I know where all the vendor bodies are buried doesn't translate well to a CV. Laura sat down next to me, read what I had, and said, "You need to actually list what you've done." So we spent the whole weekend on it. She made me quantify everything: the money saved, the contracts managed, the relationships maintained. By Sunday night, my resume was 3 pages long, and I had to cut it down. I sent it to a recruiter who specialized in procurement and contract management roles. She called me back within 2 hours. Said my background was exactly what 3 of her clients were looking for. Within 3 weeks, I had 2 solid offers, both paying more than my current salary with better benefits. One of them offered a signing bonus. I didn't even know signing bonuses existed outside of professional sports. I accepted the better of the 2 offers, but didn't tell anyone at work. Not yet. I wanted to see what Drew would do first. If he left me alone, I'd serve out a reasonable notice. If he pushed me out, well, that's what the documentation was for. Laura asked me one night during this period if I was okay. I told her I was fine. She said, "You've been checking your email at midnight for 3 weeks." She was right. I was anxious. Not because I was afraid of losing my job, I'd already mentally moved on. But because 25 years is a long time. That company was the only professional home I'd ever known. My entire adult life. Walking away from it, even being pushed, felt like leaving a house you grew up in. Even if the new owners are terrible, you still feel something when you drive past it. Then Drew made his move. He called a meeting with me and HR, sat me down in a conference room with a window view, which felt deliberate, like he wanted the meeting to feel important. He told me that after a thorough review of departmental needs, my role had been determined to be redundant, and the company would be moving in a different strategic direction. He said it with a straight face, like he'd practiced in the mirror. HR handed me a packet. Severance terms, transition timeline, the whole thing. And that's when I noticed something Drew clearly had not. The redundancy payout. See, I'd been with the company for 25 years. Under our employment terms, which were based on a legacy contract from before the last 2 CEO changes, redundancy was calculated at 1 month's salary per year of service, plus accrued benefits, plus unused vacation. I had 8 weeks banked because I never took time off, plus a pension bridge payment for employees over 45 with more than 20 years of service. Drew didn't know about the pension bridge. HR did, but Drew had apparently pushed this through without asking them to calculate the total first. The number came to just over $200,000. I saw HR lady's face when she slid the paperwork across. She knew. She definitely knew what this was going to cost his budget. Drew did not. He was still smiling. I said, "I'd like to review this with my attorney before signing." Drew's smile flickered. He said, "Of course, take your time." I said, "I will. Also, I accept the new position I was offered last week, so my last day will be in 2 weeks regardless. But I'll take the redundancy package as well, since you've declared the role redundant." The color drained from Drew's face. It was like watching someone process a car accident in slow motion. First confusion, then calculation. Then the slow, horrifying realization that he just wrote a check his budget couldn't cash. HR lady looked at Drew. Drew looked at the packet. He flipped to the page with the total, and I watched him read it twice. His jaw did this thing where it kind of moved sideways, like he was chewing on nothing. Then he looked at me and said, "We should discuss this further." I said, "I don't think we need to. You declared the role redundant. This is the cost of that declaration. It's all in the employment contract you apparently didn't read before making this decision." HR lady, and I give her credit, did not react visibly. But I could tell from the way she gathered her papers that she had tried to warn Drew about this. That packet didn't surprise her. She'd done the math. He just didn't ask her first. That's the thing about guys like Drew. They don't ask. They announce. And then they're surprised when the announcement comes with a price tag. I shook their hands and walked out. Took the elevator down to the lobby. Waved at Raymond. Walked to my car. Called Laura. She answered on the first ring. She'd been waiting. I told her what happened. She was quiet for a second and then said, $200,000? I said yes. She said, "Cole, I'm proud of you." And then she said, "Now come home. I'm making pot roast." That pot roast was the best meal I'd had in 25 years. Pause. I need a moment. Did you catch that? This man sat in a meeting designed to humiliate him and walked out holding a $200,000 check and a better job. Drew thought he was firing the janitor. Turns out he was firing the architect. And the architect kept the blueprints. This has big, you have no idea what you just did energy. Like that scene in Goodfellas, where everyone's laughing and then suddenly nobody's laughing. Captain Corner Office just blew a 200 grand hole in his own budget because he couldn't be bothered to read a contract. The irony of a contracts manager being fired by a guy who doesn't read contracts? You can't write stuff this good. My last 2 weeks were interesting. Drew tried to get me to document my processes before I left. I wrote a 5-page overview that covered the basics. Here are the vendors, here are the contract dates, here's how to access the procurement portal. Surface level stuff. Everything a competent person would need to get started. What I didn't include was the 25 years of context that made those contracts actually work. The relationships. The handshake deals. The vendor reps who would pick up the phone for me at 9 p.m. because I'd helped them hit their quotas for 15 straight years. The knowledge of which contracts had exploitable clauses and which ones were ironclad. The memory of every negotiation, every concession, every favor owed and favor given. That stuff wasn't in any document. It lived in my head. And my head was walking out the door. I didn't do this maliciously, to be clear. Nobody asked me for that level of detail. Drew never sat down with me once during those 2 weeks to learn the role. Not once. He was too busy onboarding his buddy into my position, the strategic sourcing analyst who was about to become the IT contracts manager despite having 0 contracts experience. Drew told HR it would be a smooth transition. HR apparently looked at him for a long time without saying anything. There's something I want to mention about those last 2 weeks that I think is important. A few of the longtime employees, people who'd been there almost as long as me, came by my desk to say goodbye. Patricia from accounting, Jim from facilities, Sandra who ran the front desk and always had candy in a bowl that she refilled every Monday. These were people who understood what was happening. Sandra said to me quietly one afternoon, "This place is going to fall apart without you, Cole, and I hope it does." I told her that was harsh. She said, "It's not harsh. It's math." My last day was a Friday. I cleaned out my desk, which honestly didn't take long. 25 years, and it all fit in one box. Couple photos of Laura and the kids. A coffee mug that said, "World's okayest contracts manager." The team got it for me as a joke 5 years ago. Some reference books that were probably outdated. That was it. 25 years in one cardboard box. The security guard walked me out. Standard procedure. He said, "Mr. Cole, I'm gonna miss you. You're the only person in this building who ever learned my name." His name is Raymond. I always called him Raymond. He held the door open for me and I walked to my car in the parking garage. Space B47. Same space for 25 years. I sat in the car for maybe 10 minutes. Didn't cry. I'm not really a crier. But I sat there. Let it land. Yo, I need to call something out. 25 years at a company and his stuff fits in one box. One box. That's not sad. That's a man who kept his personal life out of his professional space. He was there to work, not to decorate. Meanwhile, Drew probably has a vision board, 3 succulents, and a framed photo of himself at a leadership summit. And the security guard line? You're the only person who learned my name. That tells you everything about Cole and everything about that company. This isn't just a workplace story. This is what happens when corporations treat people like spreadsheet lines. Anyway, buckle up because what happens next is beautiful. I started my new job the following Monday. Different company, different industry, same kind of work. The new boss, guy named Garrett, sat down with me on day 1 and said, I read your resume. You managed 140 contracts solo for 25 years. I'm not going to pretend to understand how you did that. Just do it here and tell me if you need anything. That was it. No alignment meetings, no vision sessions, no transformation pillars. Just do your thing and let me know. I almost teared up. Almost. Meanwhile, back at the old company, 4 weeks was all it took for everything to fall apart. I know this because Patricia kept me updated through texts. She felt guilty about it, like she was gossiping. I told her she was performing a public service. Week 1. Drew's buddy missed the telecom contract renewal deadline. Remember that page 47 clause I mentioned? The one that saved $90,000 a year? Gone. The contract auto-renewed at the full rate. 90 grand. Poof, because nobody checked the calendar. Patricia told me Drew's face when the telecom bill came in was like a guy who just realized he left his wallet at the restaurant after the restaurant closed. He apparently called the vendor trying to retroactively apply the discount clause. The vendor's rep, a guy named Dale, who I'd worked with for 11 years, told Drew's buddy, that clause was negotiated by Cole personally. It doesn't carry over to new management without renegotiation. Dale then offered to renegotiate at current market rates, which were higher. Drew declined. The company ate the 90 grand. Week 2. A major software vendor sent a license audit notice. They do this periodically, and I always handled it because I knew exactly which licenses we were using and which ones were, let's say, creatively allocated. Without me there to manage the audit response, the vendor flagged 18 unlicensed installations. The compliance penalty was estimated at over $100,000. Now here's the thing about software audits. They're not a surprise. They happen on a semi-regular basis, and the trick is being prepared. I always kept a clean audit file, every license key, every user allocation, every installation record. Updated quarterly. It took about 4 hours every 3 months. Not hard, just tedious. And you have to actually do it. Drew's buddy did not do it. When the audit notice came, he apparently looked at the file I'd left behind, which was current through my last day, and then realized that in the 6 weeks since I'd left, nobody had tracked any changes. New installations, deactivated users, department transfers, all unaccounted for. The vendor's auditor found 18 unlicensed installations. Could have been resolved easily if someone had been maintaining the file. Nobody was. Week 3. 3 vendor contracts expired without renewal because Drew's buddy didn't know they existed. One of them was our managed backup service. The backup stopped running on a Tuesday. Nobody noticed until Friday. 3 days of data with no backup. The CTO reportedly lost it. Week 3.5, and this is the one that reportedly caused an actual shouting match in the executive suite. Someone in Drew's team signed a renewal on a printing services contract without reading it. The contract I'd spent 3 years negotiating down from 42 cents per page to 18 cents per page. The renewal auto-populated at the original rate because Drew's buddy didn't know there was a negotiated rate attached to my name specifically. The company was now locked into a 5-year printing contract at more than double what they'd been paying, on a 2,000-person company that prints a lot of paper. Patricia estimated the overspend at roughly $60,000 a year for 5 years. That's 300 grand on paper. The CFO reportedly threw a stapler. Week 4, the security audit vendor, who I'd had a personal relationship with for 12 years, refused to work with Drew's replacement. They said, and I heard this through a former colleague, "We had a relationship with Cole. We don't have a relationship with your company." They dropped us. Finding a replacement security auditor at the same rate took 3 months. Drew's budget was wrecked. And I mean wrecked. Let me run the numbers because I think the math is important. My redundancy payout, $200,000 telecom clause missed, $90,000 per year, locked in. Software compliance penalties, approximately $100,000 printing contract overspend, approximately $60,000 per year for 5 years. Security vendor replacement, 4 times previous rate emergency consulting firm, $320 per hour, estimated 30 hours per week. 3 expired contracts requiring emergency renegotiation. Unknown but significant, per Patricia conservative estimate. His department was over $400,000 in the red for the quarter. Probably closer to 500 once you factor in the consulting fees that were still running when I last checked. 4 to 500 grand. From a guy who pushed me out to save money on my $78,000 salary. The math ain't mathing, Drew. The consulting firm they hired is interesting, by the way. Patricia told me they sent 2 people, both younger than me, both billing $320 an hour each. So that's $640 an hour, combined. They've been there for 2 months now, and from what I hear, they've managed to stabilize about 60% of the vendor relationships. The other 40% are still in various states of disarray. 2 months and $640 an hour, and they're at 60% of what I used to handle solo, while also answering emails and chatting with Raymond about his grandkids. I heard through the grapevine, and I want to be careful here because I don't want to get anyone in trouble, that Drew had a very uncomfortable meeting with the CFO about 6 weeks after I left. The CFO apparently asked him, "Did you calculate the total cost of losing Cole before you made this decision?" Drew apparently said, "The role was redundant." The CFO said, "The role generated $900,000 in savings over the last decade. What part of that is redundant?" I also heard, and this part is almost too perfect, that the vendor I'd worked with for 12 years on security audits sent Drew a very polite email explaining that their relationship was with me personally, that I had secured them preferential rates based on mutual trust, and that without that personal guarantee, their standard rates would apply. The standard rate was 4 times what we'd been paying. Drew apparently forwarded the email to the CFO with the subject line, "Vendor price gouging?" The CFO reportedly replied, "That's not price gouging. That's what happens when you fire the guy who negotiated the discount." Drew is still there, last I checked. But his digital transformation project got defunded. His buddy got reassigned to a different department, and the company is currently paying a consulting firm $320 an hour to do what I used to do for $78,000 a year. As for me, I'm 3 months into my new job. Better pay, better team, better boss. Garrett sent me a message after my first month that said, "You've already saved us 40 grand on the cloud storage renegotiation. At this rate, you'll have paid for yourself by June." That felt good to read. Not in a vindictive way. Just good. Like being appreciated for the first time in a long time. I used part of the redundancy payout to pay off my mortgage. Laura cried when I showed her the statement with the 0 balance. We'd been carrying that mortgage for 19 years. She said, "I always thought we'd be 60 before that was gone." I said, "Me too, thank Drew." She didn't laugh, but she smiled. The rest of the payout is sitting in an index fund. Laura and I are talking about a real vacation, not a check email by the pool vacation, but an actual disconnected 2-week trip. First one in maybe 15 years. She wants to go to Italy. I want to go anywhere she wants to go. She's earned it more than I have. Final update. Raymond, the security guard, texted me last week. He said, "Mr. Cole, they still can't figure out the vendor portal. I overhear things." I told him if he ever needs a reference, I've got him. He sent back a thumbs up emoji. I also got a call from my old colleague Patricia, who said, "Cole, the new guy just auto-renewed a contract you spent 3 years negotiating down. We're locked in at 30% above market rate for 5 years." I laughed. Not because it's funny, because what else can you do? She also told me that Drew's digital transformation specialist, his other buddy, quietly resigned last week. Apparently, he realized that without me there to manage the existing vendor infrastructure, his job was basically impossible. He was trying to build a digital transformation on top of a foundation that was actively crumbling. You can't renovate a house that's on fire? Well, you can try. Drew tried. It didn't work. Patricia also mentioned something that caught me off guard. She said a few of the newer employees, people who never worked with me, have been asking, "Who is this Cole guy everyone keeps talking about?" Apparently, my name comes up in meetings constantly. Every time something breaks or a vendor won't cooperate or a contract turns out to be worse than expected, somebody says, "Cole used to handle this." I've become a ghost story, the cautionary tale of what happens when you get rid of the person who knows everything. I don't know how I feel about that, honestly. Part of me is flattered, part of me is sad. Mostly, I'm just glad I don't have to deal with it anymore. 25 years of institutional knowledge, $200,000 in severance, and a company that still hasn't figured out what I actually did. I hope they figure it out eventually. I'm not holding my breath, though. Laura and I went out to dinner last weekend to celebrate the mortgage payoff. Nothing fancy, this Italian place near our house that we've been going to for years. The owner, Gino, came over to our table and asked how things were going. I told him I'd switched jobs. He said, "Good for you. You look tired the last few years." Even the restaurant guy noticed. I didn't realize how worn down I was until I wasn't anymore. Sometimes I think about going back. Not to work there, never that. But just to walk through the building one more time. Past Raymond's desk, past the conference room where Drew tried to end my career, past the server room where I once spent a whole weekend negotiating an emergency cloud migration because our vendor's data center flooded and I was the only person who had the backup vendor's emergency line saved in my phone. That was 2019. A Tuesday night? No, it was a Wednesday. I remember because my wife had made pot roast and I missed it. She saved me a plate though. She always does. One more thing. I keep a sticky note on my monitor at the new job. It says page 47. Laura asked me what it meant. I told her it's a reminder. A reminder that the details matter. That the boring stuff, the clauses, the renewal dates, the handshake deals, the vendor's emergency phone number, that's what holds everything together. And when nobody's paying attention to the boring stuff, that's when it all falls apart. Drew didn't pay attention to the boring stuff. I was the boring stuff. And now he's paying $320 an hour for someone else to try to be the boring stuff. And they're not even good at it. Would you have just taken the payout and left quietly? Or would you have fought the redundancy declaration? Genuinely curious what you guys would have done. Look, Cole is the kind of guy every company has and no company appreciates until he's gone. He's the human equivalent of that one cable behind the server rack that nobody can identify. But if you unplug it, the whole building loses internet. Drew unplugged that cable and then stood there confused when the Wi-Fi died. $400,000 in losses because he wanted to install his frat brother. That's not a management failure. That's a masterclass in what not to do. And I hope every MBA program in the country uses this as a case study. Chapter 12. The time Drew destroyed a department because he couldn't read page 47. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Here's the thing about Cole. He never raised his voice. He never threatened anyone. He never even said, "I told you so." And brother, he had every right to. He just collected his 200 grand, walked out past Raymond, and went somewhere that valued him. Meanwhile, the company is bleeding money hiring consultants to replace a guy they voluntarily got rid of. If that's not poetry, I don't know what is. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever been the redundant person who turned out to be the only person who mattered? Hit subscribe and I'll catch you in the next one.